Although it's been less than 30 years since the end of the Revolutionary War, America finds itself squaring off yet again with Great Britain in the War of 1812, named that because, well, it started in 1812. Today we're going to look at the causes of the war, the major events of the war, and the effects of the war. Following Washington's precedent, Thomas Jefferson serves 2 terms as president and then steps down. James Madison is elected president in 1808 to serve as the nation's 4th president. Madison is a Democratic Republican and a Virginian, just like Thomas Jefferson was. James Madison serves 2 terms as president, but near the end of his first term, the United States declares war on Great Britain. Let's look at what happened leading up to our nation's first declaration of war. There are several things that combined to lead the U.S. to declare war on Great Britain in 1812. The 2 usually given as the main reasons are impressment of American sailors and the British trade restrictions on the U.S. As we've discussed before, impressment is the act of taking men and forcing them to serve in another's military. In this case, British soldiers were impressing American sailors and forcing those Americans to fight for the British in their war with France. As you can imagine, Americans were outraged when they learned that their fellow Americans were being taken by the British. An important note, however, is that there were thousands of British sailors who were working on American ships, so it makes sense that the British would try to get their own citizens back to help fight in their war with France. Many of these British sailors pretended to be American because, well, who wants to go fight in a war with France, right? So regardless if it was right or wrong for the British to do it, this act of impressment angered many Americans. The second main cause for war with Britain is an economic reason. In 1807, Britain passed the Orders in Council, which basically said that American ships must first stop at British ports where they pay a British tax before they could go on to any other European countries. It's almost like Britain forgot we were our own nation at this point. The reason they did this was to try to limit the United States from doing business with France, who Britain was at war with. The result was that it made lots of Americans angry that they were still trying to control the U.S. Ironically, the Orders of Council ended up being repealed in 1812 before we declared war on Britain. But because information traveled so slowly, we didn't find out that it was repealed until after war had been declared. While the 2 main reasons were impressment and trade restrictions, there were other issues that pushed us toward war. By 1812, more than 400,000 Americans had moved west of the original 13 states and were moving into American land controlled by Native Americans. Some of these Native American groups assimilated into American culture. Others strongly resisted. One of those who resisted was a great Shawnee chief named Tecumseh. Tecumseh brought together several Indian tribes to fight against the settlers. While Tecumseh was away from his Shawnee people, he had actually gone south to recruit the Creek Nation tribe to join them. The Shawnees were attacked by the American Army under William Henry Harrison. Harrison attacked and defeated the Shawnee in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Tecumseh crossed over into Canada and joined the British troops that were stationed there. So what does this have to do with Britain? Sounds like a dispute between the Indians and the Americans, right? Well, the British were supplying the Indians with weapons and ammunition and were provoking them to fight back against the Americans. So when Americans learned that the British were supporting the Indians, it pushed America closer to war with Britain. Those who pushed strongly for war were called war hawks. They were led by Kentuckian Henry Clay, whose estate Ashland is in Lexington, Kentucky. However, not everyone wanted to go to war. The idea of war with Britain was unpopular in the Federalist North. There, people did not want to do anything to interfere with trade between the United States and our biggest trade partner, Britain. In the southern and western states, where Democratic Republicans led, people wanted more land for farming and the spread of this agrarian society that Jefferson always described. War with Great Britain, to them, was necessary. On June 18th, 1812, the United States Congress voted to declare war on Britain in what to this day is still the closest war vote in our nation's history. Now, the War of 1812 lasts about 2.5 years, and like any war, there's lots of battles happening in a bunch of locations all across America. We're going to focus on a few key events of the war. The first American plan of attack was actually to invade Canada, but before the American army could even get there, the British attacked and captured Detroit. In October 1813, William Henry Harrison led American troops in the defeat of the British near the U.S.-Canada border at the Battle of the Thames. Now, the Battle of the Thames killed both Tecumseh and any alliance with Creek Nation. The following March, Andrew Jackson, who was the leader of the Tennessee militia, defeated the Creek Nation in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Jackson forced the Indians to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The treaty forced the Creek Indians to cede 23 million acres of their territory to the United States government. By 1814, the British had defeated Napoleon and France, and now they could turn their full attention to their war in America. In August 1814, the British invaded Washington, D.C., setting fire to our Capitol building and to the White House. First Lady Dolly Madison stayed behind until the very last moment, where she and some personal servants and White House servants, she was able to save a portrait of George Washington and some other valuable pieces from the White House. As the British were about to attack Baltimore, Americans raised a flag over Fort McHenry. When Francis Scott Key, a lawyer who had witnessed the night-long bombardment, saw the next morning that the flag was still there, he was so moved that he wrote a poem about it. This poem was later set to music and eventually became the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Perhaps the best-known battle of the War of 1812 actually happened after the war was over. New Orleans was an important port because whoever controlled New Orleans controlled what was allowed up and down the Mississippi River. The British had decided to try to take New Orleans. American General Andrew Jackson had an army waiting for them. As the British advanced, they marched in their typical style across an open field. Well, that made them really easy targets for Jackson's men. By the end of the Battle of New Orleans, 71 Americans were dead, but the British suffered 2,036 casualties. The win boosted Andrew Jackson's popularity across the country. This was the final battle of the War of 1812, and it actually happened after the war had officially ended. The British had decided that the war just wasn't worth the effort and the cost. But news didn't travel fast in the early 1800s, so neither Jackson nor his British opponents knew that the war had actually ended before the Battle of New Orleans had started. Another group who didn't know that the war had ended was the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party gathered at the Hartford Convention to discuss opposition to the war. They were very against the war and were trying to convince the American public that it was a bad idea and it should end. However, weeks after the convention's end, news of Major General Andrew Jackson's overwhelming victory in New Orleans swept across the Northeast. Now, because the Federalists were so anti-war and Jackson had such a big victory, it discredited the Federalists and resulted in the end of the Federalist political party. The official end of the war came on December 24th, 1814, with the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty did not really resolve the border or trade disputes. In fact, no land changed hands at all due to the War of 1812. Neither the U.S. nor the British were really winners in this war, though the Native Americans were definitely the losers of the war. While the Treaty of Ghent basically returned things to the way they were before the war, Americans were still proud that they were able to hold their own against Britain. The War of 1812 cemented American independence. Some even call it the Second Revolutionary War. American manufacturing was booming. A sense of patriotism was sweeping across the land. The young nation seemed destined for success.